In the quiet hours, when the world drifts toward sleep, you will hear a story carried by lantern light and wind, where the tower keeps its secrets until morning, and every word feels like the turning of a slow dream. The evening arrives, wrapped in the color of rain-soaked slate, and as you walk toward the rising stone of the tower, the air tastes of wet earth and quiet ash drifting from the village hearths far below. You feel the wind dragging its cool fingers across your shoulders, carrying the soft smell of pine needles and distant smoke. And the last daylight slips away like a tide receding into a darker, deeper sea beyond the hills. The tower waits above you, with its windows dark and unblinking, its walls streaked with water that glimmers faintly where the sky has not yet lost all its silver. And you hear the slow rhythm of drops gathering in the gutters. Your hands, carrying the small clay jar of oil, grow colder as the wind presses around the steps, curling upward, and the stone feels damp through your boots. Each footfall echoing softly in the hollow space, as though the tower itself listens. The lanterns hang waiting in their iron frames, tall glass throats empty of flame, their metal hinges rusting faintly with years of rain and frost. Yet tonight, for the first time, you have been told they must burn until morning. The keeper before you spoke with a voice that held neither haste nor warmth, only the measured cadence of someone handing over something older than memory, saying the light must remain through the hours when no eyes would see it. You asked no questions, because the tower seemed built from silence itself. Rising above the clustered roofs, where children's laughter now drifted thin and fading as families drew shutters closed against the coming wind. The wick in your pocket feels rough between your fingers, smelling faintly of hemp and oil, and you think of the first spark striking against flint, the small flare opening like a golden flower in the blue breath of night. The stairs rise tightly, winding through shadows where the air grows cooler, and your shoulder brushes the stone walls that shed a faint dust upon your sleeve, as though the tower exhales each time you pass another narrow slit of window. Through those windows, the world tilts away beneath you, the fields dissolving into mist, the far hills becoming only ideas of shapes against a dim horizon, the river flashing once with the reflection of a late, lonely scrap of sky. At last you reach the landing, where the wind waits, louder now, pressing through the half-open shutters as though it has been calling to you all evening, wanting to watch what you will do with the dark above the fields. The first lantern creaks on its hook when you lift it, its weight familiar yet expectant, and you smell the old iron mixed with the faint resin of wood smoke trapped from some forgotten winter, when this tower knew other hands. Pouring the oil feels like tipping warmth itself into the belly of something hungry, the scent rising sharp, then sweet, and the wick drinks quietly until it glistens, ready to carry whatever flame you dare to offer it. When you strike the flint, the spark opens with a small, impatient sound, kissing the wick until the first thin tongue of light uncurls, trembling in the draught as though surprised to find itself alive inside so much night. The glow spreads slowly through the glass, sliding across your face and hands, softening the edges of stone, turning the wind itself to gold where it sweeps past, scattering motes of warmth across the floor like drifting pollen. One by one, the lanterns accept their share of flame, each swallowing its darkness with a sigh until the whole room blooms with steady circles of light that reach toward the rafters and touch the waiting faces of the windows. Outside, the the fields lie emptied of color, the last shepherds long gone. Yet the tower begins to shine above them like a quiet star grown from earth instead of sky. Something rooted and deliberate among the folding shadows. You feel the warmth on your cheek where the glass breathes against the cold, the wind circling your ankles like a cat, unsure whether to stay or flee. And below, the village settles into its night of shutters and smoke. No one watches from the roads now, no voices drift from the tavern door. No footsteps climb the hill toward the gate. Yet the lanterns burn as though the eyes of the whole world wait just beyond the dark horizon. The keeper's words return in the hush between gusts of wind, telling you only that the light must never fail. And though he gave no reason, you feel in your bones the weight of things older than explanation itself. Perhaps it began as warning, or prayer, or promise, or simply the habit of men who fear the hours when wind speaks through keyholes and trees. Answer with the creak of their tired winter limbs leaning into each other. Whatever its beginning, the flame now belongs to you. Its glow threading through the windows where raindrops cling. Each drop a trembling mirror carrying the tower upside down into the grass, the roof lines, the waiting black ribbon of the river. When the bell in the chapel strikes once for the closing of the gates, the lanterns reply without sound, only light, their reflections gathered along the winding glass, like a constellation of small suns captured inside iron and oil. The hours will pass while the flame bends and straightens, as though breathing with the tower itself. And you will walk among them checking wicks, feeding oil, listening to the wind confess against the shutters. Night settles fully at last, erasing the last outline of the hills, folding the roads inward until even the closest fence posts vanish. Yet the tower stands awake with its new crown of gold, patient and sleepless among so much dark. You feel the quiet beginning to grow thick, the kind of quiet that drifts from sky to earth when clouds smother even the stars. And inside it, the lanterns carry on their small labor of light, as though time itself depends on them. Long after midnight, you will rest against the wall where stone holds the memory of old sun, your eyes half closed, the tower breathing around you while the flames sway softly in their cages, like dancers too weary to stop moving. Somewhere below, water slips along the riverbank with a sound like cloth pulled slowly through the hands of someone folding it carefully. And beyond that, the fields sleep, the houses dream, the roads wait for footsteps that will not come. The lanterns keep their vigil above it all, scattering their warmth outward, upward, downward, until the tower seems less built than grown from the night itself, a living thing fed by flame and wind and the steady heart of stone. And when the first pale light of morning touches the edges of the sky, you will climb again to watch the lanterns surrender their glow to the sun, each flame leaning smaller and smaller until the wicks darken and sleep. Yet even then, with smoke rising faint and blue against the rafters, the tower will remember this night, the first night, when flame and wind learned to share the same narrow, trembling circle of glass, until morning finally opened its hand. There was a man who came long after the first flame was kindled, and though his hair carried the color of frost, and his hands bore the quiet tremor of age, the lanterns never once darkened while his watch endured. You would see him climbing the spiral steps at dusk, his lantern oil balanced carefully against his side, the air gathering in folds around him, as though even the wind moved softer when it passed the narrow windows of the tower. the door always closed behind him with the sound of wood and iron meeting like old friends, a sound that drifted down to the grass below where children paused in their evening games, looking up as the first glow stirred awake. He carried no words for them, no nod of greeting, only the measured rhythm of boots against stone. The same steady climb repeated, night after night, until the world forgot what the tower looked like without his small figure ascending. The townsfolk whispered sometimes at the well in early morning when mist still clung to their sleeves, wondering if he ever rested. If perhaps his small cottage on the edge of the wood stood empty through the hours when firelight ruled. Yet no one asked him, for there was something in the shape of his shoulders, the downward bend of his gaze, that told them the lanterns belonged not to curiosity but to promises too old and private to be spoken aloud. When you first met him, you noticed the way his eyes carried the tiredness of someone who had outlived questions. His silence, not sharp but soft like the hush that falls after snow covers the fields where footsteps used to wander. He showed you how to trim the wicks with a small blade polished by decades of use, how to pour the oil so it reached just the right height, how to shield the glass when winds came pressing against the shutters. Every movement belonged to him the way handwriting belongs to the hand that writes it. Unhurried, without flourish, the gestures of a man who had surrendered everything noisy in life for the quiet labor of keeping darkness away. Sometimes, when the bells in the chapel below sang midnight across the hills, you would hear him humming low beneath his breath, not quite music, more like the memory of music, a tune softened by time until it was almost prayer. The lanterns answered in their way, leaning with the wind but never failing, each flame folding and unfolding like the pages of a book the keeper had read so often he no longer needed the words to follow its story. You learned slowly that his wife had gone many winters ago, her grave set among the birches where snow gathered early, and after that he kept the lanterns burning, as though the light itself could reach across the earth toward her. Perhaps it was grief that taught him wakefulness, or perhaps devotion, or perhaps the two had woven together until sleep became something too heavy to lift, while the lantern flames, small and persistent, offered a weight he knew how to carry. There were nights when frost drew its white flowers across the tower windows and his breath rose in silver clouds while he worked, the cold wrapping itself around his shoulders like another cloak, yet never once slowing the ritual of flame. You would sit on the stair below the landing, watching his shadow tilt from lantern to lantern, hearing the faint crackle when oil caught the wick, the glow stretching long across the stones like sunlight falling through forgotten forest branches. The keeper spoke little, but once, when wind rattled the shutters hard enough to scatter sparks across the floor, he said the darkness waited differently for everyone, and his voice sounded like wood smoke thinning slowly into the rafters above. You thought then of all the windows below where people slept behind curtains, the slow turn of dreams in quiet rooms, the years stacking gently on the shelves of their lives while the tower watched, sleepless and patient against the sky. Once, in early spring, when the river still wore its crust of ice, you brought him bread warm from your mother's oven, and he smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting as though the weight of years had loosened for a breath. He ate with the same slowness he did everything else, each bite careful, deliberate, his gaze never leaving the lantern flames that leaned like wildflowers toward the gaps where the wind reached fingers inside to test their small endurance. Later that night, he told you he had no sons to follow him, no daughters to remember his name when he was gone. And the words fell softly, as though he spoke not to you, but to the shadows themselves. You asked if someone would keep the tower lit when he was gone, and he shrugged like a man who has made his peace with questions, whose answers live far beyond the reach of his own years or footsteps. Still, he taught you everything: how to cut the wick so the flame burned clean, how to polish the glass when soot clouded the edges, how to read the wind by listening to its voice crawling along the shutters. He even showed you where the oil jars were stored beneath the trapdoor, their wooden lids tight against dust, their sides smelling of pine tar and iron hoops, the whole room holding the cool breath of centuries pressed into stone. The nights kept coming, as nights always do, folding the hills and roads into themselves, and each one found him climbing the steps, his lantern swinging gently at his side, like a faithful companion grown old but uncomplaining. Sometimes rain found its way through the smallest cracks, streaking his shoulders, while thunder moved far beyond the horizon. Yet the flames never failed, each one carried through wind and water, like a word whispered into the ear of night itself. On the last winter he lived, you brought him a scarf your mother had knitted, soft as the underside of willow leaves, and he wore it without comment, the gray wool gathering snowflakes while he trimmed wicks with the same precision as always. You remember his hands most of all, the way they moved with such patient certainty, as though they belonged not to flesh but to the lanterns themselves, as though flame had taught them its own slow language across all those years. When he was buried in spring beside the birches where the earth smelled of thaw and green water, the whole village came, even the children who had only seen him from fields below, his figure climbing through dusk toward the waiting glow. That night the tower burned as always, though it was you who climbed the steps carrying the oil, and you felt the shape of his absence in the way the wind moved through the windows without pausing as it once seemed to. Yet the flames leaned steadily toward the glass, keeping their quiet vigil. And you thought perhaps this was how the keeper would have wanted it. No speeches, no songs, only the steady breath of lantern light across another night's silence. Even now, when you climb the steps alone, you hear sometimes the faint scrape of boots on stone, a sound that fades when you turn, as though the tower itself keeps the memory of his watch the way trees keep the wind. And the lanterns burn on, their glow folded softly against the dark, carrying through each hour the patience of a man who never asked for rest, a man whose story lives only in flame and shadow and the hush between bells. It was in the middle weeks of summer, when the air above the fields shimmered like the surface of a lake, and grasshoppers sang endlessly in the tall rye, that the children first gathered below the tower to ask about the lanterns. You remember their voices floating upward as the evening slipped toward its slower colors, the thin music of them rising through the warm air while you carried the oil and wicks, their words weaving together like small birds calling across water. The tower had stood through so many years of wind and frost that most villagers no longer questioned its nightly vigil. Yet children carry a restlessness untouched by habit, and they asked with the same hunger they used when naming constellations. Some sat cross-legged in the grass, their elbows on knees and chins on palms, while others balanced on the old wooden fence where lichen spread in gray patches across the posts, their faces lifted toward the stone walls, climbing into the sky. The smell of cut hay drifted from the lower fields, where farmers had stacked the last bales, the air warm and heavy with midsummer sweetness. Crickets beginning their slow music among the hedgerows, waiting for night to press its cool hand over them. You paused halfway up the steps, the clay jar of oil warm beneath your arm, hearing the small echo of your boots fade while the children's questions floated upward, their voices sliding around the tower's corners like minnows moving through reeds. They wanted to know who the light was for, since the roads below emptied each evening when the gates closed, and travelers rarely passed after dark except during harvest fairs, when bonfires already carried enough fire to guide them home. You told them the flames were a promise, though you could not say to whom, and the answer hung in the air between you like the lingering dust stirred from wheat stalks long after the scythes had finished their work. One boy with hair the color of threshed barley asked if the lanterns kept away spirits, his voice dipping lower, as though the idea itself needed to be carried carefully across the twilight without spilling into the ears of the wind. Another child, a girl whose knees bore the green smudges of grass, wondered if the light shone so the stars would not feel alone. Her gaze wandering upward where the first pale points trembled faintly against the darkening roof of sky. You felt the warmth of the evening leaning against the stone walls as you listened, the whole hill scented with wild thyme and dry earth, the tower windows catching the last sunlight before night rose like water filling the far valleys. The children spoke of their dreams where the tower turned into a giant candle held by someone taller than the mountains, its flame so large that even the sea beyond the hills shone gold across its restless, salt-stung surface. Their words carried the looseness of midsummer evenings when no one hurries and the air tastes faintly of berries and wood smoke from cooking fires, the kind of air that lets stories gather like moths circling slowly around lamplight before doors are closed. You told them the lanterns burned because darkness itself was older than memory, and keeping a flame alive through its longest hours was like leaving bread on a windowsill for someone who might come hungry when everyone else slept. They considered this in the slow, serious way children have when twilight softens their voices, when play has drifted away and the crickets begin to sing louder than laughter, the sky above them folding into deeper blues with each passing breath. One boy asked if the tower had always stood there, his fingers tracing idle patterns through the dust at his feet, and you realized no one living remembered the hill without its crown of stone and light and wind-struck shutters. The question seemed to drift beyond even the oldest villagers, those who sat near doorways on summer nights with mugs of beer growing warm in their hands, while they watched the last carts roll in from the hayfields before the gates closed. You thought of the keeper who never slept, his figure bending toward each lantern as though listening for words beneath the crackle of wicks, and you wondered if he had once been a child too, asking why flames must outlast the moon. Perhaps someone older had told him a story now lost in the folds of time, or perhaps no one had answered, and so he learned by keeping watch that some flames survive not because of reason but because of the hands that tend them. The children leaned against the grass, their questions slowing as night pressed deeper across the hills, the first bats stitching shadows between the bell tower and the edge of the orchard, where apples thumped softly to earth in the cooling wind. You felt the air change, the kind of change that carries the smell of river water and distant rain, a reminder that even summer bends, eventually toward endings no one notices until windows rattle and flames lean hard against the gusts. The lanterns above you waited, unlit, their glass faces catching only the last traces of sun-like water, cupped briefly in stone before it slips away, and the children's eyes followed yours, toward them as though expecting answers to rise from flame itself. You climbed the remaining steps slowly, their small voices pooling below while you poured oil and cut wicks, the metal hooks cold beneath your fingers, though the air around you still held the warmth of sun-baked walls releasing their heat. When the first spark caught and spread along the wick's edge, the children gasped softly, not in fear but wonder, the sound carrying upward like the flutter of wings startled from branches by the touch of wind before rain arrives. One by one the flames opened their petals of light, each swaying slightly as if bowing to the evening, until the whole room glowed with the quiet steadiness of things built, not for show but for the long labor of endurance. The tower windows spilled gold across the grass where the children sat, and their faces shone like coins, briefly lifted toward the sun before being tucked back into the pockets of earth and shadow, waiting for night to finish its work. They stayed until the last colors drained from the sky and the crickets grew louder than their voices, until even the youngest among them felt the weight of sleep pulling gently at their shoulders, with the promise of warm blankets at home. You watched them wander down the hill in small clusters, their words drifting behind them like loose threads of song, the kind of song sung without melody or memory, only the soft syllables of children speaking to stars as they walk. By the time the chapel bell struck the hour, the hillside lay empty, except for the leaning shapes of fences and the whisper of rye fields turning silver under moonlight, while the lanterns burned above it all with their patient glow. You thought then that perhaps the flames needed no reason grander than this. The brief astonishment in young eyes, the hush that follows wonder, the way light itself seems to settle inside people quietly before slipping into their dreams. Long after the last child's footsteps faded, you sat beside the lanterns, listening to the night deepen, the glass warm against your sleeve, the smell of oil faint but comforting, the whole tower breathing softly like a creature alive beneath the stars. And you knew, as the flames leaned in the wind but did not fail, that some questions need no answers at all, only the small ceremony of keeping fire where darkness waits, only the promise that light will return again tomorrow. It began with the smell of rain before the first drop touched the earth, that sharp sweetness drifting in through the shutters like a secret whispered by the hills before the wind rose to carry it toward the waiting tower. You felt the air change around you, the way it sometimes does before weather breaks, the warmth of the day folding inward as clouds gathered above the fields, drawing the evening early across rooftops still bright with the last sun. The lanterns already burned in their glass cages when the first thunder rolled low across the valley, a sound so deep it seemed to rise from the soil itself, shaking the quiet loose from branches and fence posts waiting for night. You climbed the tower steps, carrying another jar of oil beneath your arm, feeling the stones breathe cold beneath your fingertips where rain had slipped through cracks in the shutters. The air along the stairway damp with gathering shadows. By the time you reached the landing, wind had begun sliding its restless palms along the tower walls, rattling loose bits of straw from the thatched roofs below, the whole village tilting its face toward the promise of rain. The flames bent low in their lanterns as the gusts pushed through the window frames, small golden heads bowing against the invisible fingers of wind that circled them again and again, testing the steadiness of their oil-fed breath. You checked each hook, each hinge, each pane of glass, with hands smelling of metal and ash, the lanterns shivering faintly above you, while the sky deepened into the bruised color storms carry when they have traveled far to arrive here. The first lightning came thin and white along the rim of the hills, a quiet flicker rather than a shout, though its light washed the fields for an instant in the flat brilliance of day before vanishing like a thought forgotten mid-sentence. You felt the air thicken with the waiting pause before rain begins, the entire world holding its breath in that single heartbeat, when even the crickets fall silent, listening for the sound of water breaking itself against thirsty earth. Then the downpour came all at once, 1,000 small drums beating on roofs and leaves, on river and road, the sound filling every corner until even your own footsteps along the landing seemed to belong to another world entirely. The tower swayed faintly as gusts leaned hard against its stone shoulders, the shutters crying out on their hinges, rain finding its way through every gap until the floor held, small rivers glinting in the lantern light like threads of quicksilver. You shielded the nearest flame with your sleeve, feeling the heat press against the wet cloth as wind tried to slip its cold mouth inside, the glass trembling in its frame as though afraid of what waited beyond the walls. But the flame held, flickering wildly yet refusing to vanish, the wick curling black at its edges before steadying itself again, stubborn as a heartbeat inside the throat of the storm now climbing fully across the valley in sheets of water. Thunder rolled closer, not cracking but rumbling, long and low, the kind of sound that feels like a distant wheel turning slowly beneath the earth, carrying rain and wind and night toward every barn and cottage waiting with shutters barred. You moved from lantern to lantern while water pooled around your boots, topping each one with oil, trimming wicks already blackened by wind's sharp breath, the air thick with smoke and wet stone and the restless scent of summer rain. Outside, the fields vanished beneath moving curtains of water, the fences dissolving into darkness, the roads becoming streams that carried leaves and twigs toward the river where foam gathered like torn fabric against the bridge posts beneath the chapel bell. You watched lightning reveal the world again for a single blink, the trees along the ridge tossing their arms like dancers startled awake, their leaves silvered by rain before darkness swept them back into silhouettes folding and unfolding in the wind. The tower groaned as if remembering other storms from other years, storms that had pulled at its windows and scoured its stones, yet never found a way to snuff the stubborn glow climbing its spine from base to belfry. You thought of the keeper who never slept, how he must have stood in this same place during nights when wind carried the voices of wolves through the trees, his hands steady as he guarded flame against the weather's wild insistence. The lanterns bent again and again before each gust, the flames tossing their heads like horses refusing the bit, yet every time they straightened, climbing the wick with the patience of something that has learned to survive its own small defeats. Your shoulders grew heavy with rain as you leaned against the wall between tasks, breath misting in the cool air, the sound of water drumming above, below, around, the entire tower wrapped in the restless percussion of the storm's long song. Once you thought you saw the lowest lantern falter when a sudden gust pressed through the open frame, its flame bowing so far it nearly kissed the glass. Yet, when the wind left, the glow rose taller than before, almost defiant. You felt a strange comfort then, watching each light fight its quiet battle without rage or panic, only persistence, the same persistence that keeps grass rising through stone paths and rivers, carving valleys through mountains, too proud to imagine change. Hours passed like this, rain sweeping in waves across the hills, the lanterns standing against it with their narrow circles of gold, the tower glowing like the spine of a book read by lightning, again and again before the page turns. By midnight, the wind began to wander elsewhere, its shoulders brushing less fiercely against the shutters, its voice growing tired, as though the hills had finally answered whatever question it had carried from one horizon to the other all evening. The rain softened too, no longer 1,000 drums, but a single, steady rhythm sliding down leaves and eaves, gathering beneath the gutters where it fell in long threads, toward puddles flashing pale beneath the lantern glow. You walked the landing one last time, touching each hook, each hinge, each frame where glass shone with tiny rivers sliding downward, the flames behind them curling gently, now like children sleeping after hours of wild, breathless play. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke, of rain-soaked wood and river mist, the scents folding together the way dreams sometimes fold years and faces and voices, until they belong to no single moment but to time itself passing quietly. When the last lightning flickered along the hills, too weary now to startle anyone awake, the lanterns burned on as though nothing had happened, their light gathering against the dark edges of the world the storm had failed to claim. You leaned on the windowsill, watching clouds drift apart like exhausted sails, the first stars peering down with the cautious glimmer of children returning after hiding from thunder. The fields below silvered by water where paths shone like threads of glass. The tower settled into its familiar breathing again, wood creaking softly as it dried. Ropes along the bell swaying with the gentleness of sleepers turning beneath blankets. The whole structure tired yet awake beneath its crown of faithful light. And you thought then, as the last raindrops clung to the shutters like beads of molten glass, that the storm had not come to test the lanterns at all, but to teach you how even small flames can outweight so much darkness. The horizon held the last trace of sunlight, like a thin ribbon of copper stretched across the hills. And as you climbed the tower steps, the air smelled faintly of damp grass and smoke from distant hearths settling into evening. You felt the wind brushing through the cracks in the shutters, carrying with it the cool scent of river water and wildflowers pressed flat under summer's fading heat, while the lanterns above waited patiently to catch their first flame. He arrived along the winding road that crested the hill beyond the orchard, a traveler hunched beneath a hood that was wet with dew, his boots leaving thin streaks in the dust, and you could hear the soft creak of leather over stone. In his hands he carried a folded bundle of letters, tied with string, that smelled faintly of lavender and ink, the paper edges soft from rain and handling, as though they themselves had been worn into memory before any eyes could read them. He paused at the tower's base, breath rising in thin clouds against the chill that draped the evening, his fingers clutching the bundle with care, and when he lifted his eyes, they held the quiet fatigue of someone who has walked far enough to forget the comfort of home. You greeted him without speaking, feeling the pause of wind around the tower and the river beyond. The world folded into a single instant where oil and flame and wet earth smelled like both promise and memory. He smiled faintly, almost apologetic, and handed you the bundle without a word. The rough texture of the string pressing gently into your palm, the scent of ink and wood smoke rising in the cold dusk air. You climbed the steps to the landing, his presence below, shrinking with distance. The soft weight of paper in your hand, reminding you that some messages travel slower than roads or rivers, carried instead by patient footsteps and careful hands. The lanterns above awaited you, swaying faintly in the whispering draft, their glass faces catching the last rays of sun like liquid amber. And you thought for a moment that the messenger himself had brought the light along with him in some quiet, unseen way. You opened the bundle with care, the letters unfolding with the faint crinkle of old paper, the smell of ink pressing against the warm oil and stone of the tower, a scent that seemed to gather all the hours of the day into a single breath. He had written of small things, the rising of a river, the slow bloom of apple trees in the orchard below, the ways that roads remembered footsteps long after travelers had gone, each word soft with observation and gentle patience. As you read, you felt the sun slip behind the hills, leaving the sky in shades of deep indigo and violet, the first stars appearing like small lanterns set among clouds, reflecting the tiny flames you were about to tend above the empty village. The wind brushed your cheeks and lifted your hair, carrying the faint sweetness of hay and earth and rain from the valley, while your fingers traced the letters with a reverence for the life they contained and the distance they had traveled. You set the letters aside briefly to check the oil and wicks of the nearest lantern, the warmth of its glass pressing against your palm, as if it, too, understood the importance of holding small things steady through the night. The messenger's words seemed to linger in the air even after you returned them to their bundle, the ink breathing softly against the rhythm of your steps as the lanterns accepted flame one by one, their glow climbing upward like quiet sunbeams. Outside, the hills were darkening to deep green and shadow, the river flashing once with reflected light before it vanished beneath the trees. And you imagined the messenger's boots tracing the road home, leaving behind only a faint imprint for the dew to collect. The first flame caught with a small, impatient sigh, the wick curling briefly before standing tall, and as the second, third, and fourth followed, you felt the tower fill with the quiet hum of small endurance, the way rivers press steadily through rock. You remembered the messenger's hooded figure lingering at the base of the hill, the kind of determination that only comes when words must travel farther than legs can carry. The lanterns swayed gently in the evening wind, casting golden ribbons across the stone floor and spilling out into the narrowing streets below, reaching the edges of the village where chimneys whispered smoke into the night and windows glowed faintly with supper fires. You imagined the letters resting on a table far away, the scent of oil and stone lingering faintly as they waited for hands to read them, and felt the quiet weight of connection between tower, flame, messenger, and the world beyond the hills. As dusk deepened to night, the stars peered through the clouds with shy glimmers, and you thought of the way each lantern mirrored them, a constellation of gold above the village, holding both the dark and the human care that fought it steadily. The wind softened, carrying the smell of wet earth and the faint tang of distant rain, and for a moment you could almost hear the messenger's footsteps fading down the hill, a sound as gentle and patient as the slow breathing of the world itself. The lanterns burned on unwavering, each flame a small pulse in the quiet dark, their light spilling across walls and floor and your hands as though to remind you that some messages travel not by urgency but by care and vigilance. You thought of the quiet promise inherent in every journey, the patient holding of flame against night, the careful carriage of letters and footsteps and oil through the deepening shadows that covered the valley like a soft, worn blanket. By the time the village below had settled into sleep, the river hushed and the fields held still beneath the moonlight. The tower glowed steadfast, a reminder that light and attention could travel farther than any road, farther than the eyes that sought them. You leaned against the window frame, watching the stars and the lanterns burn together, each flicker a quiet echo of the messenger's walk, a delicate rhythm woven across hill, tower, and night, carrying life and care into the soft folds of the dark. And you knew then, as the lanterns breathed warmth into the quiet of the tower and the messenger's presence faded like a memory in the distance. The village prepared for the feast long before sunset, the smell of roasting meat and sweet bread drifting from cottages like a promise carried on warm air, while lanterns in the tower waited quietly for the evening to claim the sky. You walked among the stalls in the market square, the scent of herbs and apples mingling with the dust of the cobbled streets, and the low hum of conversation pressed against the edges of your ears like a gentle tide. The children ran with small bundles of straw for the bonfires, their laughter sliding across the warmth of the evening as the last light lingered on rooftops, glinting in the brass of church bells and the edges of cartwheels. You noticed the smell of smoke curling through the lanes, sweet from cedar logs stacked for winter, and from tiny hearth fires that kept early baker's bread warm in the cooling air, carrying a sense of home into the open fields. The feast began as the sun dipped behind the western hills, the sky painted in soft vermilion and lilac, while families gathered around long tables covered with cloths that smelled faintly of lavender and worn linen, their voices weaving together in gentle harmony. You watched from the tower steps as lanterns on poles were lit one by one along the main street, golden circles spreading warmth against the deepening shadows that gathered beneath trees and arches and the quiet hills beyond the village. The wind carried the scent of wine and honey, of roasting vegetables and charred meat, blending with the faint tang of the river and the rich, earthy smell of hay, while your hands brushed the stone railing, cold yet solid, beneath your fingers. Children ran barefoot through the dew-heavy grass, squealing as the first bonfires crackled, sparks leaping upward to join the first stars that appeared, their light reflected briefly in small, eager eyes before drifting toward night's deeper blue. You climbed the tower, feeling the smooth stones beneath your palms and the warmth of lantern glass pressing softly against your skin, each step carrying you farther from the village noise into the hush of the evening wind circling the tower walls. From above, the feast spread beneath you like a living tapestry, colors of cloth and flame and golden hair moving gently among shadows, the music of lutes and soft drumbeats weaving through the air as firelight flickered along faces lifted toward the sky. The lanterns waited for your hands to fill them with oil and strike the wicks, the air inside the tower scented with the faint tang of smoke and resin, while the first night birds drifted past the open windows with quiet, invisible wings. You lit the first flame, its glow climbing slowly along the wick, bending gently in the evening draught, and then the next, until each lantern above the village bloomed like flowers made of gold, tilting and swaying as though learning to dance with the wind. Below, laughter softened, voices turning inward as bell chimes echoed across rooftops, and rooftops echoed the call back to the feast, while you moved along the landing, adjusting wicks and tilting glass, feeling the steady heat of light against your palms. The stars thickened in the sky, their pale pinpricks reflected faintly in the river, and the wind carried the smell of damp earth and crushed time from the hillsides, weaving together night and village and tower into a single slow breath that seemed to hold time itself. The feast quieted gradually as plates emptied and chairs scraped softly across the square, the last stories told in murmured tones while fires burned low, their smoke curling toward the heavens as if in thanks for another summer's harvest shared. You leaned against the tower wall for a moment, feeling its stone warmth soaked with the day's sunlight, the wind brushing across your face, and thought of the way the lanterns now held the feast in their soft golden glow, as memory made solid by light. The lanterns swayed slightly with the night breeze, their glow reaching into alleys and through open windows, reflecting in the small puddles left from an earlier shower, and you felt the delicate balance between flame and shadow, as if the world itself were inhaling. You remembered how the keeper had once told you that light is patient, and watching the lanterns now, you felt the truth of it in your bones. Each small flame, a quiet pulse, holding the night steady against the slow drift of hours. A faint smell of smoke and melted wax mingled with the scent of evening flowers, the soft perfume of wisteria and roses from garden walls curling around the tower. And you felt the hush pressing gently against the village as the last revelers found their way home. The wind whispered faintly, carrying a note of river water and earth, and the lanterns held their light, the soft gold spilling across the roof tiles and cobblestones like a thread sewing night to memory. You thought of the silence that follows music, the hush after laughter, and how the lanterns now seemed to hold that same pause, a gentle exhale of warmth and steady light, letting the feast live on in the quiet spaces between stars. The bonfires burned low, the smoke rising in thin threads toward the moon, and the village below exhaled its final words into the dark, while above the tower kept its watch, each lantern breathing softly, carrying the memory of celebration in the glow of flame. You leaned against the stone, listening to the hush of the world as it settled, the river murmuring faintly in its bed, the wind brushing along rooftops and trees, and felt the slow weight of night folding gently over the village and the tower alike. Long after the last embers faded below, the lanterns held their gentle vigil, warm circles of light marking the night sky, spilling over the stone and hills, keeping both memory and village alive until the stars themselves seemed to bow in quiet acknowledgement. And you knew then, as you adjusted each flame and breathed in the scents of evening and rain-soaked earth, that light and memory are always intertwined, and the lanterns would hold both in their small, unwavering glow until dawn finally pulled its veil across the hills. The first frost settled softly over the village, coating rooftops and cobblestones in a delicate, crystalline sheen, and you felt the cold air press lightly against your cheeks as you climbed the tower steps, carrying the familiar weight of oil jars. The river below had grown slow and silver, reflecting the pale winter light, and you inhaled the scent of frozen earth mingled with pine from the distant hills, the chill pressing softly into your lungs while the lanterns waited above. Each step you took was accompanied by the quiet creak of stone beneath your boots, the air sharp and clean, and the faint scent of smoke curling upward from hearths, reminding you that warmth existed even in the coldest corners of the world. The village seemed smaller in winter, its streets quiet, footprints pressed into the frost lingering like whispers of those who had passed before, while the tower loomed above as a sentinel, patient and steady, its lanterns dark until your hands brought them to life. You traced the edge of each window, feeling the smooth, cold glass beneath your fingers, and for a moment imagined snowflakes drifting silently against the panes, their small, crystalline shapes settling like tiny promises upon the stone sills. The first lantern caught its flame, trembling faintly in the winter draught, and you adjusted its wick, the warmth of glass seeping through your palm, a gentle pulse that reached into the chill and held it at bay, even if only for a moment. The second and third flames followed, each one unfolding slowly, petals of gold curling against the gray air, and you felt the tower breathe quietly beneath your hands. Stone warmed faintly by both flame and the memory of countless winters endured. The wind moved through the tower with a gentle insistence, carrying the scent of frost and distant smoke, rustling the loose bits of straw from nearby roofs and making the lanterns lean slightly as though bowing to the invisible current that flowed around them. You watched the village below, its chimneys sending thin threads of smoke upward, the light from the few remaining windows soft and golden, and you thought of the people inside, warm and quiet, their breaths rising slowly as the night gathered around them like a thick, familiar blanket. The lanterns above flickered gently, bending toward the faint winter sun, as though drawn to the memory of warmth, while the snow-laden hills beyond the village seemed to hold their breath in anticipation of evening, each flake sparkling in the faint reflected light of the flames. You remembered the first time you had tended these lanterns in winter, how the chill had bitten through gloves and cloak alike, and yet the flame had seemed to answer, rising proudly against the cold, teaching you that warmth is sometimes only measured in light. Each lantern held its small fire against the darkening sky, the glow spilling onto the frost and turning each icy crystal into a tiny jewel. While your fingers adjusted wicks and glass, the rhythm of work both comforting and unbroken, a quiet song of devotion. The river shimmered like molten silver beneath the fading daylight, and you imagined the sound of ice cracking gently beneath its slow current, though it was almost imperceptible, absorbed by the hush that settled across the village and pressed against the tower's walls. Snow began to drift lightly in the higher hills, tiny flakes catching the golden lantern light for brief, miraculous moments, and you felt the quiet wonder of winter pressing gently into the room, a reminder that even cold brings its own beauty and stillness. You breathed in the mingling scents of oil and smoke and frost, feeling the lantern heat against your palms, and the air carried a distant memory of pine and moss, of footsteps pressed into snow long ago, settling the mind into a slow, gentle rhythm. The lanterns leaned slightly with each gust of wind, flames bending but not breaking. Their persistence, like the soft song of a season, endured quietly, and you realized that light, no matter how small, can teach patience in the face of frost and shadow. The village below seemed to glow faintly beneath the snow-laden trees, windows spilling warmth and quiet onto the streets, while the tower above carried the patient fire of lanterns that refused to be dimmed, holding winter at a gentle distance from stone and air alike. You adjusted the final flame, feeling the familiar weight of the lantern against your palm, and watched it rise steady and bright, the glow spilling upward, illuminating frost crystals pressed against the panes and casting long, soft shadows across the cold stone floor. The wind settled into a whisper, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and earth, while distant hills became shadowed shapes in the dimming light, and the tower seemed to hum softly with the quiet music of enduring warmth in a cold and patient world. You imagined the villagers sleeping, safe in their homes, the slow rise and fall of breath echoing the gentle sway of the lanterns above, and for a moment the entire village felt folded into the careful, unwavering rhythm of light and memory. The lanterns burned steadily through the night, each one a small pulse of gold against winter's silver and gray, and you understood that even in the stillest, coldest hours, vigilance and care could hold a gentle warmth across stone, air, and sky. You felt the quiet of snow beginning to fall softly beyond the tower windows, the delicate touch of flakes on cold cheeks, and the lanterns seemed to lean toward them, bending their warmth into the night, weaving light and frost together in a slow, endless dance. Even when the village and hills became almost entirely shadow, the flames held their golden vigil, their soft glow spilling across window panes and rooftops, a patient, comforting presence in a winter night where quiet and light moved together in unbroken harmony. And as you leaned against the stone wall, feeling the subtle heat of the lanterns through the cold, you knew that light, like memory, endures, and that even the most silent and frozen nights could be warmed by the patient, gentle song of fire and care. The wind carried a faint, almost imperceptible sound through the tower windows, a gentle murmur that made the lanterns sway as though listening, while outside the snow fell silently, covering rooftops and fields in a hushed silver blanket that softened every shape. You pressed your hands to the stone wall, feeling its cold seep through your gloves, and the scent of pine and frozen earth drifted faintly through the draft, mingling with the warmth of oil and the faint smoke of lantern wicks. A shadow moved along the tower steps, fleeting and soft, like a memory pressing against the edges of the present, and you turned slightly, aware that someone had come to witness the quiet ceremony of flame and winter unfolding together. The visitor's breath rose in a thin mist, carrying the smell of wood smoke and river water, the kind of scent that makes one remember distant hills, forgotten roads, and evenings spent watching stars emerge slowly above frost-tipped fields. You could hear the snow landing softly on the window ledges, each flake a whisper against the glass, and the lanterns leaned slightly toward the cold, their gentle glow spreading warmth through the tower, while the visitor moved without sound along the stone floor. The figure paused beside the tallest lantern, a hand reaching out as if to feel the heat through the glass, and you noticed the faint ripple of curiosity and awe in their stance, like someone discovering light in a dark world for the first time. Outside, the trees bent under the weight of snow, their branches silver and delicate, moving slightly in the wind, and you felt the quiet pulse of the tower beneath your feet. Stone holding warmth and history in ways that felt almost like breathing. The lantern's glow pooled across the floor, soft circles that stretched toward the visitor's boots, reflecting the slow rhythm of their movement, and the air carried a faint aroma of lavender and cold wood, intertwining with the subtle, warm scent of burning oil. You thought of all the nights the tower had seen, storms and snow, visitors and quiet solitude alike, and how each flame had survived, bending against wind and draft, teaching patience and endurance in ways that words alone could never convey. The visitor knelt near the smallest lantern, fingertips hovering just above the glass, and you noticed the way their breath mingled with the warmth, the small exhalations rising like smoke into the night, almost unnoticed except for the subtle curl of the cold air. Outside, the snow shifted under the wind, creating faint ripples that mirrored the movement of the flames, and you felt the connection between light and world, between lanterns and visitor, a quiet weaving of warmth, shadow, and memory into a single, delicate thread. You walked closer, the soft creak of boots against stone blending with the distant hum of the frozen river, and the visitor looked up briefly, eyes bright with wonder, and nodded, as though acknowledging the quiet lesson the lanterns had been holding for years. The wind moved again, carrying faint scents of earth, pine and hearth smoke, and the snowflakes drifted lazily past the windows, some catching the lantern light for a brief, fleeting sparkle. A silent applause for the small ceremony unfolding inside the tower. You adjusted the largest flame, its glow spreading steadily, and the visitor's eyes followed the movement, reflecting gold, and you felt the warmth not only in your hands, but in the shared hush, a connection formed silently between watcher and light. The snow outside deepened in colorless silence, each flake landing softly on roof and branch, and the lanterns seemed to respond, their flames leaning slightly toward the window, bending as if greeting each new snowflake, creating a dialogue in warmth and winter's cold. You noticed the visitor tracing faint patterns in the frost gathering on the window panes, their gloved fingers leaving temporary marks, and you realized that curiosity and care carry a light of their own, one that flows alongside flame, as quietly persistent as snow falling. The lanterns burned steadily through the hours, casting soft shadows that stretched and bent across the stone, while the visitor moved slowly from one to another, observing each flame with reverence, letting the warmth of light seep into hands, face, and memory alike. Outside, the stars began to pierce the dark sky. Each pale pinprick reflected faintly in the snow, and the tower glowed beneath them, a small constellation of gold on earth, holding winter in patient vigil through the hush of night. You felt the cold air press against your cheeks, carrying the scent of frozen moss and distant hearth fires, while the lanterns cast circles of warmth onto the stone floor, and the visitor seemed to inhale the quiet like a long-waited breath. Time passed without measure, each moment stretching softly into the next, the snow thickening gently outside, the wind whispering through the tower, and the flames leaning patiently against the night, teaching endurance, patience, and the quiet, unspoken magic of steadfast light. The visitor finally rose and moved to the window, looking out at the village below, rooftops silver with snow, smoke curling from chimneys, and lantern light reflected in the frost. And you felt the shared understanding that some wonders are known best when observed in silence. You adjusted the wicks one last time, feeling the warm glass against your palms, while the visitor remained near the window, still, silent, witnessing the world held steady between flame and frost, the tower humming softly with long, patient memory. Outside, the wind softened, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth, while the snow lay thick and quiet across every surface, and the lanterns burned steadfast, holding the night against winter's cold. A gentle heartbeat of light in a world of frost and shadow. You knew then that the visitor would carry this memory away like a lantern in their heart, a quiet flame pressed gently against the dark, and that the tower itself, with its patient lights, had offered both warmth and understanding in the stillest hours of the year. And as you leaned against the cold stone, inhaling the mingled scents of snow, pine, and oil, you understood that some presences need no words, only the steady glow of flame and the quiet passage of time, the shared hush of a winter night held in light. The tower always held its warmth differently once midnight passed, the air still carrying the faint perfume of smoke and oil, yet folding into a deeper silence, as though the world outside had retreated fully into snow and dream. You felt it when you pushed open the wooden door, the cold air clinging to your coat as though reluctant to let you go. The iron handle still cool beneath your fingers, despite the lanterns glowing steadily against the walls. Somewhere above, the night wind turned softly around the tower's stone shoulders, carrying scents of pine needles, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of apples left to winter on crooked branches. While inside the light pressed gently into corners, keeping its patient vigil, the keeper stood near the tallest lantern, shoulders bent with time, yet moving with the unhurried grace of someone who had grown accustomed to the slow passage of hours, his face carrying the faint sheen of warmth from flame and long-kept secrets. His coat smelled faintly of cedar and wax, and you noticed the small bundle of tools at his sidewick's oil flasks, a brass trimmer dulled by years of use, each piece familiar yet treated with the same quiet reverence as the flames themselves. You watched him work, the soft scrape of wick against metal blending with the faint hiss of wind near the shutters, and you felt the warmth growing richer as he leaned close, breathing carefully as though tending not fire, but something almost alive. He never hurried, never wasted a gesture, his hands folding the moment as though it were parchment, too delicate for sharp movement, and the air carried the mixed aromas of smoke, brass, wool, and the faint tank of winter pressing against the walls. The lanterns leaned slightly as though in gratitude, the flames swaying with each adjustment, and you realized there was a language between keeper and light, a wordless conversation told in small motions, in warmth shared between oil and hand, glass and breath. Outside, the village windows had gone dark one by one, the snow lying thick along the roofs, while the tower alone glowed like a beacon, its golden circles softening the night, reaching no farther than the branches, yet holding the dark at bay. The keeper's eyes held that same glow, a reflection of flame yet tempered by something older, quieter, as though each night he carried not only oil and wick but also memory, guarding stories no one else had asked to hear. You thought then of the long winters the tower had endured, winds clawing at its shutters, storms bending the trees until their branches brushed the stone. Yet always the lanterns burned, the keeper's slow footsteps echoing like heartbeat against stair and floor. He once told you, voice low as embers, that flame remembers its purpose even when no one watches, that light does not question darkness, only exists within it, carrying its small warmth forward without demanding that the world become bright. Tonight, his words seemed truer than ever, the snow folding itself softly across fields and rooftops, the sky heavy with clouds hiding the stars, while inside the tower each flame leaned closer, as though listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing. You watched his hands pause over the smallest lantern, the one near the northern window, and you noticed how carefully he straightened its wick, almost tenderly, before lowering the glass again, the tiny flame responding with a brighter, steadier glow. The air around him seemed thick with warmth, despite the winter pressing against the walls. The mingled scents of oil, iron, and wool, wrapping the room like a slow-moving river, carrying away every sharpness, every thought too hurried for this hour. You thought of how many winters he must have walked this same circle of flame, hands moving through smoke and quiet, each night identical yet never empty, the tower filling itself with memory the way snow fills the hollow spaces of earth. Sometimes, he said, the flame carried things away that words could not, drawing sorrow and restlessness into its heat until only calm remained, as though the lanterns knew the weight people left behind when they passed through on cold nights. You wondered if that was the secret, that the keeper tended not only fire but feeling, gathering every unspoken heaviness into the circle of warmth, letting it drift upward in the faint curls of smoke that slipped through the high windows. Outside, the wind changed, softer now, carrying the faint metallic taste of snow waiting to fall, and the keeper turned slightly, his face lit unevenly by flame, as though he were listening to the sky itself, leaning close to the tower's stone. He set the last oil flask aside, the brass trimmer folded carefully into his coat pocket, his boots creaking faintly on the worn floorboards as he crossed to the center of the room where the lantern light pooled like warm, shallow water. You felt the night deepen around the tower, its edges softened by wind and snow, and the keeper's presence steadied it all, the lanterns answering him in flickers and sways, as though they recognized his footsteps, the slow pattern of his breathing. He poured a small cup of tea from the kettle near the stove, its steam carrying the earthy scent of dried leaves, and he handed it to you wordlessly, the warmth moving through your gloves, through your chest, loosening the cold from your bones. The lanterns hummed softly, not with sound, but with glow, their flames bending toward one another, as if sharing heat across the small distances of air. And the keeper finally leaned back, sipping his tea, eyes resting on the tallest flame of all. He told you then, in the same quiet voice, that the tower had never once gone dark in winter, not through storms, nor wind, nor nights when snow lay so thick it swallowed the paths, because the lanterns had become the village's heartbeat. You understood that it was not light alone they offered, but constancy, a warmth that expected nothing, yet waited every night, so that even those awake in the small hours could look toward the hill and see gold burning against the dark. The keeper never explained more than that, never told you why he began this work or when it would end, only moved among the flames with the same slow devotion, as though some silences were too old for breaking, too necessary for words. Outside, the first new snowflakes touched the glass, their shapes melting instantly in the faint heat, and the lanterns leaned softly toward them, flame and frost meeting briefly before vanishing, like two travelers passing on a road without speaking. The tea warmed your throat, the air carried the layered scents of smoke, pine, and iron, and the keeper's boots creaked once more as he climbed the stair toward the upper windows, his lantern held high, scattering gold along the stone. You stayed below, watching the flames bend and settle, and you thought about the secret he carried, one not of words, but of devotion, of light tended through every wind and winter, a promise kept even when no one was there to see. And as the night closed deeper around the tower, The lanterns glowed with their steady patience, the keeper's footsteps echoing faintly above, the snow pressing itself softly against the walls, while the secret lived on in warmth, flame, and unwavering light. You remember the night beginning with that strange stillness that always comes before deep winter claims the world, the air dry and brittle, carrying the faint smell of iron and frost even before the first snow began drifting through the dark. The tower lanterns glowed softly above the village, their light folding across the windows and narrow streets like thin sheets of warmth, while beyond the last roofs the river wound in darkness, its current muttering softly beneath the crust of growing ice. You had walked out to the edge of the trees, boots creaking in the powdery snow, the cold air pressing against your scarf and finding every open seam of your coat, while the lantern light behind you reached only so far across the white fields. The keeper had told you the river always froze differently each year, some winters sealing itself in a single night of sharp wind, others drawing slow silver threads of ice across the surface until the water moved beneath with quieter and quieter voices. That evening it seemed undecided, the current still weaving around patches of frost and pale islands where reeds bent stiffly, the moonlight turning each ripple into metal before breaking it apart again, while the air thickened with the smell of snow waiting to fall. You stood there listening to it, the river whispering beneath its thin armor, the trees creaking faintly behind you, the wind carrying the cold smoke from the village chimneys in slow blue ribbons that drifted apart before reaching the forest edge. The lanterns burned on the hill above, warm circles glimmering in the tower windows, their flames shifting against the glass whenever the wind turned, as though the night itself moved carefully around them, keeping its distance from the fragile brightness. The keeper joined you after a while, his boots leaving narrow tracks across the snow-packed path, his lantern held low so the light gathered in soft circles along the ground, making the ice sparkle where the first frost thickened near the banks. He said the river listened to the cold differently than the earth did, that it argued first before surrendering, as though the current believed it could carry the whole season away if only it moved fast enough through the dark. You watched the surface change as he spoke, the edges slowly stitching themselves with white seams, the moonlight sliding across the forming plates of ice, while somewhere deep below a slow groan rose, the sound of water folding itself into stillness. The air smelled of pine needles and frozen mud, of lantern oil, and the faint sweetness of wood smoke drifting from the village, each scent threading softly through the cold until it felt as though the night itself carried a memory on its breath. The keeper raised his lantern higher, its glow warming the nearest branches, and he said, "The villagers used to tell stories about the river choosing its moment to freeze, as though winter waited for some signal before sealing the water in silence." You wondered what signal the lanterns gave, burning above the snow on the hill, their lights stretching softly toward the river, yet never reaching far enough to warm its surface, only glimmering faintly across the dark water before breaking into scattered pieces. The cold deepened as you stood there, the kind that slips through gloves and boots no matter how tightly wrapped you are, the kind that settles behind your ribs like a small weight, turning each breath into a pale ghost drifting upward. The keeper seemed to carry the cold differently, as though years of walking between flame and snow had taught his body to move with the season instead of against it, his lantern swinging gently as he studied the darkening water. He told you the river would freeze fully by morning, that once it did, the night would grow quieter, as though moving water had been carrying away all the small, restless sounds, and now they too would settle beneath the ice. You thought about the lanterns then, glowing steadily in the tower, the flames moving in their slow golden rhythm, while the world outside changed from water to ice, from wind to snow, from night to something deeper than night itself. The keeper watched the first crack lace itself across the far bank, a thin silver line splitting the moonlight, and he nodded slightly, as though this moment belonged to the river alone, a decision made after long quiet conversation with the cold. You felt the air grow heavier with snow clouds, the wind falling away until even the trees stopped their creaking, and in the distance the tower light glowed warmer, a single point of gold in a world turning slowly toward silver and white. The keeper said the river held reflections differently once it froze, that moonlight and lantern glow stayed longer on the surface, caught in the pale sheen, as though the ice had learned how to hold the sky without ever letting it sink through. You imagined the village children coming down in the morning, their boots scattering snow across the frozen banks, their laughter carrying in the clear air while the lanterns above still burned, the flames watching everything with their quiet patience. The keeper turned back toward the hill after a while, his lantern painting small circles of gold along the snow. His shoulders bent slightly against the cold, though his steps remained unhurried, as though he carried warmth from flame to flame with him. You followed slowly, the cold deepening with every breath, the smell of smoke and pine drifting closer as the tower grew larger against the dark, its windows glowing like held embers, promising heat though the snow had already begun to fall. Inside, the lanterns leaned softly in their glass chimneys, flames moving like slow dancers whenever the door opened, the warmth carrying scents of oil, wool, and faint ash, as though the air itself had been steeped in long years of winter nights. The keeper set his lantern beside the others, the flames answering with small flickers, as though recognizing one of their own, and he poured tea from the kettle near the stove, its steam rising in soft clouds, carrying the earthy scent of dried leaves. You sat near the tallest lantern, watching its glow slide across the floorboards, the light warm against your gloves, while outside the wind began moving again, carrying the first real snowflakes against the glass with faint, almost shy touches. The keeper handed you the tea, his hands smelling of smoke and brass, and said the river would be silent now until spring, the ice carrying the winter moon across its back, while the lanterns carried the rest of the night in flame. You thought of the water folding itself beneath the ice, the current turning slowly in darkness, and above it all, the tower watching with its golden windows, the keeper tending flame while the snow wrapped the world in deeper and deeper quiet. The tea warmed your breath, the lantern light gathered like small suns along the walls, and you realized the night belonged equally to flame, river, and snow, each keeping its own silence while the wind drifted softly through the sleeping village below. And as you sat there, listening to the faint hiss of snow against the shutters, the lanterns burned steadily on, carrying their warmth through the long hours, while the river lay silent beneath its new white armor, holding the winter sky in perfect stillness. The night had been long, filled with the soundless weight of snow pressing against the eaves, the wind turning soft and secretive, as though reluctant to disturb the sleeping world, while the lanterns in the tower burned with steady patience above it all. You had fallen asleep near the hearth, the warmth carrying the smell of pine logs and old stone. And when you awoke, the air held that thin blue light that comes only before dawn, when the world seems suspended between breath and silence. The keeper was already awake, his shoulders hunched near the window where frost curled in delicate patterns across the glass, his breath clouding faintly as he studied the sky beyond the pale orange glow of the last lanterns. He told you the birds would come soon, the winter birds that circled the tower every year on the coldest mornings, their wings cutting slow shapes through the air as though tracing the invisible paths of the wind itself. Outside, the snow lay unbroken across the fields, its surface glowing faintly in the fading lantern light, while the trees along the riverbank stood like quiet witnesses, their branches heavy with frost and the faint glitter of a moon not yet gone. You wrapped the blanket tighter around your shoulders, feeling the soft scratch of wool against your skin, the cold seeping through the floorboards in waves, while the scent of the tea leaves from last night lingered faintly in the still air. The keeper opened the door with careful hands, the hinges giving only the smallest sigh, and the cold swept in like a slow tide, carrying with it the distant sound of wings moving somewhere beyond the edge of the frozen fields. The first bird appeared as a shadow against the pale sky, its wings wide and slow, the faint gray of dawn outlining each feather as it glided once around the tower before settling on the highest beam of the bell frame. More followed, dark shapes against the growing light, their calls low and rough-edged, echoing across the snow-covered roofs of the village where no smoke yet rose from the chimneys, the world holding its breath for morning to arrive. The keeper said they returned every winter, always before the sun touched the top of the tower, as though the birds carried some ancient memory that bound them to this place where flame and wind shared the same narrow ledges. You stepped outside into the brittle cold, the snow creaking underfoot, the air smelling of iron and distant wood smoke as you tilted your face upward to watch the growing circle of wings, carving quiet patterns through the fading night. The lanterns still burned behind the frost-clouded windows, their golden glow falling in soft columns across the snow, catching on the drifting feathers when the birds wheeled lower, their shadows sliding silently across the frozen ground. The keeper spoke about the villagers who once believed the birds carried messages between seasons, their flights a kind of language the wind understood, each slow circle above the tower a word spoken in the dialect of winter skies. You watched one bird glide so near the highest lantern that its wings caught the glow, the feathers turning briefly to bronze before the wind lifted it away again, leaving the light to flicker softly in its glass prison. The air held a deep stillness beneath the sound of wings, the kind that settles only before sunrise, when time itself feels slower, the cold sharpening every edge of sound until even the snowflakes seemed to fall in deliberate silence. The keeper told you the birds came only until the first sunlight reached the tower roof, then vanished beyond the river as though called elsewhere, their circles tightening in the pale sky until the last shadow slipped away into the tree line. You wondered what bound them here, what kept their wings returning each winter to this lonely tower where flame burned through the long nights, its warmth touching only the keeper, the glass, and whatever stories the birds carried in their small, dark eyes. The wind shifted then, carrying with it the dry rustle of feathers and the faint smell of distant smoke from the first waking chimney, while the horizon softened from gray to pale rose, the sky unfolding slowly as though careful not to wake the earth too quickly. The birds tightened their circles, moving lower above the tower roof, the air trembling faintly with each wing beat, though the snow below remained untouched. A white sheet marked only by your footprints leading back toward the waiting door. The keeper watched them with the same expression he gave the river when it froze, as though these winter rituals belonged to a rhythm older than words. The lantern flames seemed to understand as they flickered softly in the pale light. You felt the cold deepen through your boots, the smell of iron and pine threading the air, the taste of last night's tea lingering faintly on your tongue as you tilted your head back to catch the last slow circle before the sun came. The horizon brightened in thin layers of color, the first gold touching the edges of the snowfields, sliding toward the tower roof where frost glimmered like powdered glass, waiting for the warmth to turn it into water again. The birds began to leave as quietly as they had come, wings lifting them into the widening sky, their shadows thinning against the growing light until only the faintest calls drifted back from the far trees along the river. The keeper said they would not return until the next deep cold, that the tower lanterns would burn many more nights before the birds came again to trace their slow circles above the snowbound fields at the edge of dawn. You followed him back inside, where the air still carried the warmth of flame and wood smoke, the lanterns burning lower now, their lights soft and drowsy, as though preparing to surrender the tower to the pale gray of morning. He poured fresh water into the blackened kettle, the fire catching on the logs with a low sigh, the scent of smoke weaving through the room as though reluctant to leave the comfort of stone walls and steady flame. The birds were gone when you looked again through the window, only the pale sweep of snow and the faint line of the riverbank showing against the early sunlight, the sky carrying no trace of wings or calls or circles drawn in wind. The keeper said the birds never left feathers behind, never marked the snow with their shadows, as though their visits belonged more to memory than to the waking world, their wings stirring only the dreams of those who watched them come and go. You sat near the lanterns, feeling their warmth seep through the chill, the flames moving with quiet, tired gestures as the last stars disappeared, the tower slowly trading its night of firelight for the softer gray of day. And in that stillness between the last flame-bright shadows and the first pale sunlight, you felt as though the birds had carried something away with them, some unspoken thing the tower kept through winter nights until their wings came to claim it again. The lanterns had burned low through the night, their flames bowing gently in the currents of air that wandered the stone stairwell, while outside the first colors of morning spread across the horizon like watercolor soaking into heavy winter paper. You rose from your place near the hearth slowly, the chill of the tower floor running through the soles of your feet, the air carrying the faint scent of extinguished wicks and ash from the fire that had faded into a soft red glow. The keeper was already awake, sitting near the narrow window where light filtered through the frost-laced glass, his breath pale in the cold air as though the morning had forgotten warmth altogether and carried only the memory of winter winds. He told you the snow would not melt today. His voice, you looked through the wavering frost and saw the snow stretching endlessly beyond the village roofs, not the gentle thawing drifts of early spring, but a frozen sea of brightness that held no trace of yesterday's warmth or footsteps or voices. The air tasted of iron and wood smoke when the keeper opened the door, the wind pressing against the hinges with a low groan before slipping through the room like a ghost, circling the lantern flames that bent but did not falter. You stepped outside, and the cold folded around you immediately. A stillness that touched your skin like powdered glass, the scent of pine and frozen earth mixing with the distant sound of water locked beneath a skin of ice. The sky carried a muted light, the kind that offered no promise of warmth. Only a pale glow stretched thin across the horizon, while the snow beneath your boots gave the dry, brittle sound of wood breaking under careful hands. The keeper walked slowly toward the edge of the clearing, his steps leaving dark impressions in the crusted snow. The lantern light spilling from the tower door behind him like honey sliding down the rough grain of old wood. He told you the village once believed days like this belonged to the winter spirits, the ones who carried silence on their backs and walked through the world before the first birds sang, turning rivers to glass and air to crystal breath. You watched the way the smoke from the distant chimneys rose only halfway before flattening in the frozen sky, as though even fire feared to climb higher, its warmth scattering in the wind before reaching the cold edges of morning. The snow beneath the trees shone with the faintest blue shadow, a glow that felt older than sun or lantern flame. The branches above heavy with white weight that fell only when the wind passed through with its thin, sighing voice. You pulled the blanket tighter, the wool rough against your fingers, the air cold enough to make each breath sharp in your chest. Yet there was a beauty in the way frost glittered along the railings, like threads of silver left by forgotten hands. The keeper knelt near the well, brushing away the snow crust with his sleeve to find the rope frozen in a coil. The water beneath sealed in a hard skin that held the faint reflection of the pale lantern-lit tower above. He said the villagers used to leave candles along the edge of the well on nights when the cold grew too deep, small flames burning in a ring of light as though the earth itself needed warmth before it would give water again. You imagined those nights, the dark shapes of people gathering with flickering candles held against the wind, the wax dripping onto stone, while voices whispered beneath the heavy silence of stars. Wrapped in their own frost-bound glow, the snow along the roofline shifted when the wind rose, spilling soft powder that caught in the lantern light, drifting slowly toward the ground, as though reluctant to leave the shelter of beams that had held winter after winter for so many years. The keeper's breath curled through the air when he spoke again, saying the snow would not melt until the sun stood directly above the tower, yet the clouds carried the pale look of days when light never quite reached the frozen earth below. You followed him back toward the door, your footprints dark against the unbroken white, the tower lanterns burning steadily within, their glow touching the edges of the doorway like warm hands held out to the bitter wind. Inside, the air felt thick with smoke and the lingering sweetness of burned wood, the walls holding the memory of fire the way the snow outside held the memory of moonlight, both unwilling to give back what they had been given. The keeper stirred the embers until a faint flame rose again, its light folding across the stone floor in slow, drowsy waves, the warmth creeping toward your cold fingers like an animal returning after too long in the dark. You sat near the hearth and listened to the quiet, the snow outside pressing its silence against the tower walls, while the lanterns above swayed faintly in the wind that never truly slept, even when the world below had stilled. The kettle began to steam slowly, carrying the earthy scent of the tea leaves waiting beside it, the smell curling upward like the memory of summer fields long vanished beneath the frozen breath of winter nights. You thought of the snow lying so thick across the hills that even sound seemed softened, footsteps sinking without echo, voices swallowed before they could rise. The whole world wrapped in a cold so complete it felt almost tender. The keeper poured the tea into 2 chipped cups, the heat slipping into your palms like river water breaking through ice, the steam fogging the narrow window where the pale day pressed without warmth against the frost-bitten glass. He told you the snow had stayed once for 40 days straight, refusing sun and wind alike, until even the birds circled lower as though searching for the earth. They remembered beneath the white silence that had swallowed it whole. You sipped the tea slowly, its warmth touching stone and shadow in equal measure, the flavor holding the faint bitterness of leaves steeped too long in waiting water. The lanterns above gave a soft crack when the wind pushed against the glass, the flames bending like tall grasses in river currents, their glow falling across the walls in shapes that looked briefly like wings before sliding into stillness again. The keeper said the snow was part of the reason the lanterns burned through the night, because warmth did not belong only to bodies but also to the memory of earth itself, as though the ground waited beneath the weight of winter for signs of fire. You felt the truth of it in the way the flames leaned toward the dark corners, filling them not only with light but with a kind of patience, as though the tower itself listened to the wind and snow and held its breath for spring. The day passed slowly, the sky never brightening beyond pale gray, the snow outside lying quiet and unmoved, while inside the tower the lanterns burned on through the hours, as if time itself were measured not by clocks but by flame and shadow. And as the sun slipped behind the thick winter clouds without ever touching the frozen fields, you felt as though the world had agreed to remain this way a little longer, wrapped in white silence, the lanterns keeping watch against the deepening cold. The lanterns swayed gently in the tower windows as evening fell, their light leaning across the darkening snow like gold threads slowly unraveling against the gray-blue edge of the coming night, each flame whispering to the next as the wind began to rise. You stood near the narrow door where the cold air slipped in faint ribbons through the gaps in the wood, the scent of pine smoke and iron drifting through the room as the keeper fed another length of dry birch to the low fire. Outside, the sky had turned the deep, heavy color of ink left too long in a glass jar. The last traces of day pressed thinly against the horizon where the sun had already fallen behind the line of distant hills. The wind moved first through the highest branches, carrying a sound like the long, low breath of the earth itself, as though the fields and the woods and the frozen river had conspired to speak in a single, wandering voice. You listened from the doorway while the keeper poured water into the kettle, its thin, metallic ringing mixing with the hollow sighs sliding through the pines, the sound carrying with it the sharp smell of resin and frozen bark. The lantern flames tilted each time the wind passed, the glass chimneys clouding faintly with smoke before clearing again, the glow climbing the stone walls like the slow rise of dawn caught and held inside the tower's narrow ribs. You stepped out into the courtyard with the wool cloak drawn tight, the cold threading through the fabric as though searching for skin, the air filled with the smell of snow about to fall, though none had begun yet. The wind deepened as it moved through the trees along the ridge, the trunks groaning softly like ships turning against a heavy tide, the branches above answering with the thin, whistling tones of wood stretched against winter's long wait. You felt the sound before you understood it, the vibrations running faintly through the packed snow beneath your boots, the air carrying not only the wind's restless breath, but also a murmur that seemed older than the language of voices. The keeper joined you with a lantern in his hand, the flame pulling a small circle of warmth between you and the night, his face marked with the shadows of the glass. As he said, the wind often brought such songs before the snow returned. You watched the trees bending together in slow, deliberate movements, the wind weaving through them in currents that rose and fell like the sea, the branches striking faint rhythms that sometimes almost shaped themselves into words. The sky above carried no stars yet, only a soft, shifting brightness hidden behind the thickening clouds, a light without source or warmth that touched the edges of the world faintly, as though the day had forgotten to leave completely. You closed your eyes for a moment and listened to the sound curling through the woods, the wind moving between the trunks in long waves, the pitch rising and falling until it almost seemed like the echo of distant singing. The keeper told you the villagers once believed the wind carried the voices of those who had lived in these valleys long before the tower was built. Their words stretched thin and wandering as they searched for the warmth of firelight. You imagined them following the frozen river bends, crossing the snowbound fields beneath the dark pines, their voices threading through the air like smoke looking for a chimney, carrying memories too heavy for silence alone to hold. The lantern light shifted again when the wind leaned hard against the tower, the glass rattling faintly before settling, the flames steadying themselves like tired travelers gathering strength after too many miles in the cold. You and the keeper walked along the edge of the trees where the wind moved in long, slow bursts, the snow at your feet marked only by the narrow path you had taken earlier when the day still held its thin winter light. The air smelled of cedar and distant wood smoke, the kind that drifts from chimneys when houses settle into evening warmth, the wind folding those scents into its restless breath before carrying them higher toward the hills. You felt the cold touch your face where the scarf had slipped, the air sharp yet strangely clean, as though each gust scrubbed the world of sound and color before allowing anything to return again in quieter, smaller pieces. The keeper stopped near the tallest pine where the branches swung heavily, his lantern light touching the lowest boughs that dripped with old ice, the wind running through them like a musician drawing long notes from a worn instrument. He said the voices always came before snowfall, as though the wind carried warnings stitched into its breath, not of danger but of the stillness to come when the world would sleep beneath white silence again. You thought of the snow waiting in the high, locked clouds above, the weight of it pressing faintly against the edges of night, while the wind kept speaking through the trees, its song rising as the lantern flame dipped lower in its glass. The path back toward the tower felt longer in the deepening dusk, the wind weaving behind you with the sound of branches brushing together like hands passing secret messages across the darkening sky. The courtyard walls held the air still for a moment when you stepped inside, the lanterns along the stone edges glowing steadily while the wind circled restlessly above, carrying its hollow voices toward the distant hills again. Inside, the keeper hung his cloak by the hearth where the fire had grown smaller. The wood collapsed into glowing shapes that broke softly under their own weight, sending tiny sparks into the warm, low air. You stood near the window where frost had begun to climb the corners of the glass, your breath clouding the pane as you looked out toward the black edge of trees, now bending deeper against the rising wind. The kettle began to whisper on the hook above the fire, its steam mixing with the smell of pine smoke as the keeper set out 2 cups again, the chipped edges catching the light that swayed slowly from the nearest lantern. You listened to the wind running across the hills, the sound lifting and falling like the tide of a sea you could not see, its movements shaping the night into something both restless and strangely comforting at once. The tea carried warmth through your fingers when the keeper passed you the cup, the steam softening the air as though even the wind outside leaned closer to catch the scent curling upward toward the rafters. He said the voices would quiet once the snow began, the world holding its breath beneath the white weight until only the steady flames of the lanterns and the slow fall of flakes remained to keep the night from slipping too far into silence. You watched the doorway where the wind still pushed faintly against the wood, the flame nearest the window bowing low before rising again, its glow spilling softly across the walls like water climbing the edges of a darkened well. The keeper leaned back in his chair with the cup between his hands, his eyes half closed as the wind sang along the roofline above, its hollow tones wandering through the beams before fading again toward the waiting hills. You felt the weight of warmth gathering in the room, the air thick with wood smoke and tea and the faint sweetness of candle wax, while outside the wind carried its last restless song before the coming snow stilled the world completely. And as the lanterns burned on through the night, their flames folding slowly against the dark, you felt the quiet deepen with each gust until only the promise of falling snow remained, waiting beyond the hills where the wind had gone. You find yourself walking the quiet path toward the tower once again, feeling the familiar weight of night around your shoulders, the cool air brushing softly against your cheeks, as though the darkness itself wished to soothe and guide you closer. The lanterns are already glowing in their windows above, golden points against the deepening blue, their light trembling in the faint wind. There is always a hush here when evening comes, a kind of reverence that wraps around the stones, the grass, the narrow stream beside the road, as though the world knows these hours belong to silence and memory. Your footsteps sound muted on the worn path, softened by the loose earth and the fallen leaves that give off the scent of rain-soaked wood, the fragrance rich and sweet beneath the cooling air of early night. Somewhere far beyond the trees an owl calls, its voice drifting like a single bell through the shadows, fading slowly until only the whisper of wind remains, circling through the high branches and stirring the faintest shiver in their leaves. The tower waits ahead, as it always does, the light within it holding steady, as though the flames behind those small windows have forgotten how to falter, their brightness painting the nearby stones in strokes of gold and amber. You pause for a moment beneath the old elm near the bend in the path, feeling the roughness of its bark beneath your fingers, the wood cold but alive, the roots deep and patient beneath the soil, like thoughts too old to be spoken. From here you can see the lanterns more clearly, each flame a little world of its own, rising and falling with the quiet rhythm of air, yet never dimming, never surrendering to the darkness that presses so gently around the tower's walls. You wonder, as you have wondered before, who first lit them in the long-ago years, whose hands carried the oil and the flame up the winding stairs. whose heart decided the night would never again be left without this golden watchfulness. The path carries you onward, as though drawn by the glow itself, the night thickening behind you, while the air grows warmer ahead, touched by the breath of firelight drifting lazily from the tower's narrow windows. When you reach the base of the stone steps, you feel the faintest trace of warmth on the air, a mingling of burning oil and old wood. The scent of flame softened by age until it feels less like fire and more like memory itself breathing outward. The door stands open just enough for you to slip inside, its iron hinges sighing softly as you push it wider, the sound echoing once up the long spiraling core of the tower where the light leans downward in golden rings. Inside, the walls carry the warmth like a secret, the stones holding it close so that even here near the ground you can feel the quiet pulse of heat radiating downward from the lanterns far above. Your hand glides along the smooth stone as you climb, the steps curving higher through air that smells of warm metal and faint smoke, the air thinning slightly as though the tower were gathering its breath the higher you go. The lanterns wait in their alcoves along the walls, some close enough for you to see the way their glass has clouded with age, tiny imperfections catching the light until the glow bends softly through them like sunlight through mist. You pass one after another, feeling the heat against your face, the flames trembling faintly yet never falling low, as though the fire itself has grown accustomed to this endless duty of guarding the tower's quiet heart. Each step takes you further from the coolness of the earth below, wrapping you instead in a cocoon of warmth and flickering gold, the air alive with the faintest crackle, as though the lanterns are speaking in voices too small to be heard. You wonder if the wind ever tries to reach them here, if the night ever presses its cold hands against the windows, only to fall back again when it finds the flames waiting like quiet sentinels, unwilling to surrender their post. The climb carries you toward the top where the largest lantern always burns, the one whose light can be seen across the fields for miles, its glow steady through fog, through rain, through all the long unbroken hours until morning. When you reach it, the room opens wide around you, the ceiling arching upward into shadow, the windows looking out over the sleeping hills where the night pools like ink in every hollow. The lantern stands at the center on its iron pedestal, its glass shining so bright you cannot see the flame itself, only the soft trembling aura that wraps the room in its unwavering warmth. You stand near it for a long time, feeling the heat on your skin, watching the way the golden glow clings to the stone walls until they seem almost alive beneath it, breathing slowly in the hush of the tower's uppermost chamber. The windows stand open to the dark, yet no wind crosses the threshold, as though the night itself knows this is not a place to intrude, that here the flame belongs to something older than weather or hour or season. You rest your hand lightly on the iron frame, feeling the steady warmth humming through it, a warmth so constant it seems less like fire and more like the quiet heartbeat of the tower itself, keeping watch through every darkened hour. Far below, the world lies silent, the fields stretching into shadow, the river glinting faintly where the moon slips free of the clouds, the distant trees breathing in slow unison beneath the weight of midnight. You feel the hush settle deeper, as though time itself has grown drowsy, the air in the tower thick with warmth and faint smoke, the silence broken only by the occasional flutter of flame against glass. It is here you always linger, standing near the great lantern, while the smaller ones burn steadily below. The whole tower glowing like a single slow candle offered to the vast and listening dark. You think perhaps this is why the lanterns never go out, why the flame passes from one night to the next without fail, as though the tower itself remembers something the rest of the world has long since let slip away. Perhaps it is not only light they keep, but memory, the warmth of all who have climbed these steps before, the echoes of hands that have tended the flames, the soft murmur of footsteps circling upward through the years. When at last you descend the spiral stairs again, the air cools against your skin, the warmth falling away in slow breaths, until only the faint scent of oil and smoke lingers like a dream on the edge of waking. Outside, the night folds around you once more, the hills wide and waiting beneath the stars, the glow of the lanterns steady above, as though they will burn until the sky itself grows pale with morning. And as you walk back along the quiet path, the air cool and sweet against your face, you carry the warmth with you, like a small, unspoken promise the night has made to its own long silence. The path back to the tower feels longer tonight, as though the earth itself wishes you to slow your steps, to let the night linger just a little longer before the first quiet stirring of dawn reaches the horizon. The air carries that deep coolness only found in the hour before morning. A hush so complete it feels like the whole world holds its breath, waiting for something that has not yet begun but will come whether it is ready or not. Somewhere along the river a thin curl of mist rises from the water, the silver threads drifting slowly across the grass, as though the earth itself exhales in its sleep, the breath spreading wide and low until the fields were a cloak of dreamlike pale. You follow the same path you have always taken, the small stones beneath your feet smooth and familiar, the leaves scattered along the edges damp with dew, so fine it glimmers faintly in the lantern glow reaching from the tower ahead. The air smells of water and cold earth, yet beneath it lingers the faintest trace of smoke carried down from the windows above, the sweetness of oil burned long into the hours when every other light in the world has vanished. You pause only once beside the low wall of stones near the bend in the path, resting your hand on their rough surface, cool with night, feeling the lichen and moss that have grown here over years, too many to count. The tower waits with the same stillness it always holds, the lanterns glowing as though they have never known darkness, their light falling softly on the worn stones, so the walls seem to breathe in pale warmth against the great hush surrounding them. The door stands open again, as though the tower itself expects you, its iron hinges catching the faint light, so the curve of the metal gleams like water rippling in the distance of a dream. You step inside, and the warmth folds around you slowly, the air rich with the scent of oil and flame, the walls holding the heat like memory pressed deep into stone, until even the silence feels warm to the touch. The stairs wind upward through their long familiar circle, each step carrying you through air that glows softly where the lanterns lean outward from their alcoves, their glass catching the light so the spiral seems shaped from gold itself. As you climb, the air thickens with the fragrance of burning oil, that faint sweetness softened by time until it smells less like fire and more like the quiet heart of the tower, breathing steadily through the hours. Your fingers glide along the wall, the stone smooth in some places, rough in others where centuries have left their marks. the coolness seeping briefly into your skin before the warmth above reaches down again like an unhurried hand. The lanterns burn in their steady row, each flame a small world of light that trembles only slightly though the night presses close at the windows, the flames holding as though the darkness itself has no power to cross this threshold. You remember how many times you have climbed these same steps, how each visit feels the same yet different. The air carrying small changes, the thickness of mist outside, the smell of rain in the wind, the distant echo of an owl fading across the hills. Tonight the silence feels heavier, though not in any way that unsettles, more like a blanket drawn gently across the earth, the quiet carrying a weight of peace so deep it makes even your own footsteps seem reluctant to sound. When you reach the final curve, the room at the top waits in its wide stillness, the great lantern at the center, glowing with the same steady flame that has always been here, the same soft heat slipping outward across the floor of stone. The windows stand open to the paling edge of the sky, where the faintest gray touches the horizon, the first fragile thread of morning weaving upward while the rest of the heavens still sleep in their deep blue silence. You stand beside the lantern and rest your hand against the iron frame, feeling its warmth steady beneath your palm, the glow bending softly against your skin so your fingers seem made of gold where the light traces them. The air smells faintly of smoke and cool wind, a mingling of night and flame, as though the tower keeps both in its walls until they belong to one another, until the boundary between dark and light feels thin as a single breath. Below, the smaller lanterns burn in their narrow alcoves, the glow falling through the spiral stairs in ribbons that sway faintly when the wind crosses the windows, the light moving like the slow turning of water beneath a quiet sky. You wonder who will climb these steps after you, whose hands will tend the flames, whose eyes will watch the night fold itself into morning with the same unspoken reverence that always fills this room before the first light of day arrives. The great lantern burns without flicker, as though it knows the hour has nearly come, the flame rising and falling gently, yet never faltering, its glow wrapping the walls until even the deepest corners breathe with warmth. The sky beyond the windows begins to pale, the stars fading one by one as if the night is slowly gathering its scattered jewels, tucking them away before the first colors of morning spill across the horizon. You stand with the warmth on your face and listen to the hush, the tower holding its breath for those few lingering moments when the world belongs neither to night nor day but only to stillness itself. The wind shifts through the open windows, carrying the faint smell of water from the river, the coolness brushing across your hands, so the contrast between air and flame feels like the tower itself exhaling before the light fully comes. The hills beyond the tower soften in the growing gray, the trees along the edge of the fields dark against the paling sky, the river glinting faintly where the first thin blade of light slips free of the horizon. When the sun finally breaks, the flames do not falter, their glow turning paler but still steady, as though the lanterns burn not for the night alone but for something older, something the day cannot erase with its bright sweep of hours. You watch the light climb slowly across the floor, touching the stone walls, reaching toward the iron frame where your hand still rests, until the warmth of the flame and the warmth of the sun mingle without edge or boundary. The tower stands, as it always has, its lanterns keeping their silent watch even as the sky shifts from gray to pale blue even as the birds begin to stir in the trees below, even as the first sounds of waking drift across the fields. When you finally leave, the steps carry you downward through the warmth and shadow, the air cooling with each turn until the door opens once more to the quiet earth now touched by morning. The lanterns burn behind you as you walk away, their glow fading slowly with distance, yet never fully vanishing. The tower standing against the sky, with its long memory of night and flame unbroken by time or season. And as the day opens across the hills, you feel the warmth still lingering on your hands, the scent of smoke and oil trailing faintly behind you like something carried not on the air but within the heart itself, steady and unending.